As shown in the first part of this investigation, the famous Colosseum in Rome was not built in the 1st century AD. It was constructed in the 19th century by Roman popes to resemble ancient ruins from the outset. Let us consider the following question: why would the popes in the 19th century choose to construct the Colosseum specifically? If they wanted to erect some grand ancient structure in Italian Rome, why did they decide on an amphitheater? Why not the ruins of some gigantic palace or temple? Most likely, the decision to build the Colosseum was not coincidental. The popes probably had certain hidden reasons for allocating their resources to construct an enormous ancient amphitheater in Rome, rather than some other type of structure. If we turn to the reconstruction proposed by the authors of the New Chronology, according to which the Roman popes were refugees from Constantinople who moved to Italy around 1453, it becomes evident that their reasons were likely rooted in memories of a massive amphitheater that once stood in Constantinople before their flight. Since Constantinople was built at the end of the 14th century, it follows that the amphitheater, which served as the prototype for the Colosseum, must have been constructed between the late 14th and the first half of the 15th century AD. According to the New Chronology, this corresponds to the true era of antiquity during which the Colosseum was built. Thus, it is possible that the enormous amphitheater known as the Colosseum did indeed exist in ancient Rome, and that some ancient historians truly mentioned it. However, ancient Rome is not the Rome in Italy. The ancient authors used the name Rome to refer to Novgorod the Great, Yaroslavl of the 14th century, as well as to the New Rome, Constantinople, of the late 14th–15th centuries. Since ancient amphitheaters were predominantly built in the south, where they could be used year-round, the true Colosseum is more likely to be found not in Yaroslavl but in New Rome, Constantinople, that is, modern-day Istanbul. This gave rise to the idea that the true Colosseum should be located in Istanbul. However, if one looks at guidebooks to Istanbul, they do not mention any remnants of an enormous ancient amphitheater. Does this mean that it truly does not exist and never existed there? Of course not. Guidebooks are mainly written by historians. And as we have often seen, modern historians are quite inclined to conceal information that is inconvenient for them. Let us begin with the fact that the Colosseum in Istanbul, then Constantinople, is explicitly mentioned in the canon Byzantine law collection of the 14th century, Syntagma Canonum by Matthew Blasteres. Matthew Blasteres, in particular, writes, Justinian's novella provides a much more detailed account on the dissolution of marriages, clearly outlining the reasons for which a husband or wife may issue a divorce or release their cohabiting spouse. The husband sends a letter of divorce to the wife and retains her dowry for himself for the following reasons: if she goes to horse races, spectacles, or the Colosseum to watch, without her husband's knowledge or against his prohibition. It is absolutely clear that the Colosseum mentioned by Matthew Blasteres was located specifically in Constantinople, where Blasteres lived and worked, and not in the distant Italian Rome. Moreover, when speaking of the Colosseum, Blasteres directly refers to a decree by Emperor Justinian, who reigned in Constantinople. Thus, it appears that in the 14th–15th centuries, there indeed existed a Colosseum in Constantinople. Let us now turn to old maps of Istanbul. What do they reveal? Here we come across an astonishing discovery. The Colosseum is quite openly depicted on most old maps of Istanbul. For example, consider an old map of Istanbul from 1572, featured in the book Civitatis Orbis Terrarum by Georg Braun, Cologne, 1575. In the very center of 16th-century Istanbul, there stands a massive amphitheater explicitly labeled as the Colosseum, Coliseum de Spiriti. Despite inaccuracies in coordinate representation, a common feature of most old maps, the exact location of the depicted Istanbul Colosseum is not difficult to determine. Notice that the Colosseum is shown near the serpent column, Colonna Serpentina, and very close to the historic column, Colonna Historiata. The latter is drawn somewhat farther from the Hagia Sophia than the serpent column. Even closer to the Hagia Sophia is the column on the square, Piazza Colonna, which is depicted as the nearest to the Hagia Sophia among the three columns named on the map. Further note that the number of named columns on the 1572 map near the Hagia Sophia exactly matches the number of obelisks and columns currently standing at the Hippodrome near the Hagia Sophia. There are precisely 3. Moving away from the Hagia Sophia, these are the Egyptian obelisk, or obelisk of Theodosius, the serpent column, and the Constantine's obelisk, or the walled obelisk. This gives us the following correspondence between the named columns on the 1572 map of Istanbul and the obelisks that stand in this location today. The Egyptian obelisk in Istanbul corresponds to Piazza Colonna, column on the square, on the map. It is the closest to the Hagia Sophia among all the columns and obelisks on the Hippodrome. The serpent column is named on the map with its contemporary name, Colonna Serpentina. It is correctly placed on the map between the Egyptian obelisk and the Constantine's obelisk. The Constantine's obelisk, the walled obelisk, corresponds to Colonna Historiata, historic column, on the map. It is located at the farthest end of the Hippodrome from the Hagia Sophia. This is a section of the 1572 map of Istanbul, highlighting the Colosseum, the Hagia Sophia, and all 3 columns named on the map. Their relative positions exactly correspond to the relative positions of the Hagia Sophia and the 3 obelisks currently standing at the Istanbul Hippodrome. Moreover, the middle one, the serpent column, is marked on the map with the same name it is called today. Thus, we come to the unequivocal conclusion that the remains of the Colosseum in Istanbul should be sought near the Constantine's obelisk, at the opposite end of the Hippodrome from the Hagia Sophia. Indeed, this is precisely where the ruins of a massive amphitheater are located in modern Istanbul. The amphitheater arena is heavily damaged, but the remaining sections of its walls are sufficient to assess its colossal size. Inside, it is completely filled in, forming an elevated oval platform. A college building and other structures have been built on this site. This is a satellite photograph of the Istanbul Coliseum. The photograph also shows the adjacent section of the Hippodrome with its 3 columns. Although the Istanbul Coliseum is completely built over, its outlines are clearly visible from above. This is because many sections of the Colosseum's walls have been preserved. Where the walls are no longer standing, the surrounding streets still follow the former outline of the structure. For comparison, here is a satellite photograph of the Colosseum in Italian Rome. The sizes of the 2 amphitheaters are comparable. Specifically, the dimensions of the Istanbul Coliseum are 140 meters along the major axis and 125 meters along the minor axis. The dimensions of the Colosseum in Italian Rome are major axis 188 meters, minor axis 156 meters. We see that the linear dimensions of the Italian Colosseum are approximately 30 to 40% larger than its Istanbul prototype. Moreover, the Italian Colosseum is slightly more elongated, while the authentic Colosseum in Istanbul was more rounded. Repeated attempts by activists to persuade Istanbul authorities to include this historical monument among the city's tourist attractions have been unsuccessful. They encountered stubborn resistance from historians overseeing Istanbul's antiquities. These historians are adamantly opposed to the public learning about the existence of the ruins of a massive ancient amphitheater in Istanbul. Why? The reason has only recently become clear. As some historians likely understand, if information about the Istanbul amphitheater begins to spread, it will eventually become apparent that it is not merely an arena, but a Colosseum. And thus, the world would recognize the existence of a second Colosseum. This would immediately raise the question, which of the two Colosseums is genuine? Clearly, upon impartial investigation, the Italian forgery would struggle to compete with the authentic Istanbul original. This is what historians fear. Too much of the accepted historical narrative is tied to the Italian Colosseum. If the Roman Colosseum is revealed to be a forgery, the entire framework of Scaligerian history, closely intertwined with the history of Rome, could begin to unravel. This is why efforts to promote the Istanbul amphitheater face persistent resistance from historians. The Istanbul Coliseum has preserved not only its walls but also some internal chambers. However, access to them is currently restricted. The door leading inside is locked and is almost never opened. Nevertheless, in 2006, participants in the New Chronology project managed to obtain several photographs taken inside the chambers of the Istanbul Coliseum. This was possible because the Istanbul Coliseum is not marked on any modern maps of Istanbul. Historians pretend that it simply doesn't exist. As a result, the key to the door leading to the inner chambers of the Colosseum is entirely in the possession of the principal of the college built atop the Colosseum. However, the principal of the college also prefers not to draw attention to his arena, fearing that if it becomes too famous, his school might be relocated to a less desirable location. Even so, negotiations with the principal were successful, and they managed to obtain the keys and permission to film inside the Colosseum. 3 years later, on November 19, 2009, one of the project participants, Gleb Nasovsky, visited the college while in Istanbul and approached its principal, Mr. Orhan Aykut, requesting access to the inner chambers of the arena. The principal proved to be a very hospitable and pleasant person. He treated the guests from Moscow to delicious Turkish tea and then, accompanied by several staff members, guided them into the Colosseum. However, he stated that calling this structure an arena was a significant mistake. "It's merely an imagined arena," he said. In reality, he insisted, it's just a cistern for storing water. He repeated this assertion several times with emphasis, making it clear that the name of the Colosseum was an important matter for him. By that time, after analyzing the photographs, it had already become evident that the cistern theory did not hold water. Although there are indeed groundwater levels beneath the Istanbul Colosseum, this is likely what led someone to dub it a cistern. In reality, the groundwater beneath the Colosseum only serves to confirm that it is the genuine Colosseum described by ancient authors. Upon entering the Istanbul Colosseum, it becomes immediately clear that it is no cistern for water but a massive arena. The cistern tale was likely fabricated by historians, and the college principal merely repeated their narrative. Inside the Istanbul Coliseum lies a complex labyrinth of vaulted chambers and passageways, divided by thick, uneven walls. These walls are constructed from ancient flat bricks, lime concrete, and, partially, white stone. A comparison of the brickwork in the Istanbul Coliseum with that of the Colosseum in Italian Rome is instructive. The two appear significantly different. In one case, we see genuine antiquity from the 14th–15th centuries. In the other, we see a 19th century remake. Interestingly, some of the basement chambers of the Istanbul Coliseum are partially filled with water. It's worth recalling that one of the legends about the ancient Colosseum claims it was built on the site of an ancient pond. Today, this legend is attributed to the Colosseum in Italian Rome. However, that structure stands on dry ground. Of course, over the centuries, the groundwater that formed the pond could have receded. But beneath the Istanbul Coliseum, the water has not disappeared. It still stands in its foundations, perfectly matching the legend about the construction of the ancient Colosseum on the site of a pond. The location of the Istanbul Coliseum on or near groundwater is clearly reflected in several old maps of Istanbul. Moreover, some maps explicitly show that springs were located beneath the Colosseum. For example, let us consider a map of Constantinople from the handwritten Geographia by Pietro del Massaio, once owned by the King of Naples and dated to 1456. Here, the Colosseum is depicted as rectangular rather than circular for some reason. However, its location is correctly indicated. It is exactly the same as on the 1572 map. In both cases, the Colosseum is shown near the last of the three columns, counting from Hagia Sophia, with the middle column being the twisted serpent column. On the map from the Geographia of the King of Naples, a stream is clearly shown flowing directly out of the door of the Colosseum. Nearby, two additional springs are depicted merging into one stream that flows through the city and into the Sea of Marmara. Thus, it is highly probable that the site of the Istanbul Colosseum was previously a pond formed by the springs in the area, as mentioned in the legend of the Colosseum. It is worth noting that in the map from the Geographia of the King of Naples, the Colosseum is depicted as intact and undamaged. It is shown covered with a canopy. If we trust the dating of the map to 1456, or at least that it was copied from an older 15th century map, it implies that during the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453, the Colosseum was still whole. This aligns with the reconstruction suggesting that Constantinople was built by Dmitry Donskoy in the late 14th century, less than a century before the Ottomans arrived. According to the new chronology, the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, who founded Constantinople, and the Russian Grand Prince Dmitry Donskoy are one and the same person. He founded Constantinople at the end of the 14th century after the Battle of Kulikovo and moved his capital there from Vladimir Suzdal, Russia, or the Roman Kingdom. It follows therefrom that the Istanbul Coliseum was built in the late 14th to early 15th century during the reign of Dmitry Donskoy and his descendants. Thus, during the Ottoman conquest in 1453, it was still quite new and later fell into ruins under Ottoman rule. It is likely that the Ottomans deliberately destroyed it, as they did with many other monuments of antiquity from the 14th–15th centuries. Let us now turn to the drawing of Constantinople from the famous Nuremberg Chronicle by Hartmann Schedel. The Nuremberg Chronicle is dated to the late 15th century, allegedly 1493, Germany. Due to the small size of the drawing, very few buildings within Constantinople's city walls are depicted. Presumably, only the most important and famous structures are shown. Among them is the Colosseum, located in the same place as on the earlier maps, near the third column obelisk, counting from Hagia Sophia. This time, the Colosseum is drawn as a massive circular amphitheater cracked on one side and overgrown with trees inside. Again, it is situated near the source of a stream that flows into the Sea of Marmara. Here is another old depiction of the Istanbul Coliseum. The Hippodrome of Constantinople is shown, at the edge of which the partially ruined Colosseum is located. On the exterior side of the Colosseum, a pond is depicted, enclosed by a low semicircular wall dam. Judging by the drawing, the dam was directly adjacent to the Colosseum wall and could have been filled with water from the underground springs beneath the Colosseum. The resulting reservoir could have been used for naval shows. It is important to emphasize that the reservoir is shown outside the Colosseum, not inside it. Historians, however, seem to have misunderstood and imagined that naval shows were held inside the Colosseum, with the arena allegedly flooded with water, a claim that is unlikely to be true. The caption under this drawing is very interesting. It states that the circus or hippodrome, Circi Civi Ippodromi, in Constantinople has existed since the time of Emperor Flavius Constantine Augustus. That is, apparently, since the founding of the city by Constantine the Great, whose full name was Gaius, or according to some sources Marcus, Flavius Valerius Constantine. This suggests that the Istanbul Colosseum was built by the Flavian emperors, Constantine the Great and his sons. And that explains why the Colosseum is sometimes referred to as the Flavian Amphitheatre. By the way, this very name, Amphitheatrum Flavium, is inscribed on a marble plaque hanging above the entrance to the Italian Colosseum. So, let's draw a conclusion. According to old maps and drawings, the Istanbul Colosseum stood on or near underground water sources. According to some sources, an artificial pond was adjacent to its outer wall, where naval battles might have been held. Groundwater still stands in the basements of the Istanbul Colosseum today. Therefore, the legend that the ancient Colosseum was built on the site of an ancient pond likely refers to the Istanbul Colosseum. Historians, however, mistakenly associate it with the Italian Colosseum, which was most likely built on dry land.